So I believe last time this is where we were. And what I want to point out to you about this information is it's not readily available to everybody. Can you just go out? No wonder this thing's acting goofy. Can you just go out and get this kind of information for a publicly traded company? No, this is only information that's available to the people on the inside. So if you're on the inside, sure, you can get this kind of information and figure these things out. But we want to be able to look at publicly traded firms and get this kind of idea about what's going on with them. So what we want to do is look at balance sheet and income statement stuff and be able to figure out what's going on inside the company. So we talked about the operating cycle being the inventory plus the inventory period plus the accounts receivable period. If I were going to figure out the inventory period, what two pieces of information would I need from these financial statements?
Beginning and ending inventory, maybe?
Inventory, very good. She got the easy one. What's the other one? I'll give you a hint. You have to start with inventory turns. And in order to figure inventory turns, you have to have inventory and cost of goods sold. She's amazing. Okay, so that's going to get us inventory turns. Now, so it's cost of goods sold divided by inventory. Now, does anyone know why we use cost of goods sold instead of sales when calculating inventory turns? Yeah, so inventory is recorded at cost and cost of goods sold is at cost. So we've got an apples to apples there. If, on the other hand, we're looking at accounts receivable, which one would we use? Cost of goods sold or sales? Sales, because that's basically at our retail price, as is the accounts receivable. So I just gave away the two accounts you'd need to calculate the accounts receivable period, and that would be net sales divided by accounts receivable. Now, let's ask this question. You know, I had it on the top of my brain there. Okay, so, but there's one more period that we have to calculate. Now I remember. So, how do I get the number of days once I get these turns measures? I've got inventory turns, I've got accounts receivable turns. How do I calculate the number of days? I'll give you a hint. There's a number on top. Yeah, 365 divided by turns. Why 365? Yeah, it's the number of days in a year. So we've got 365 days per year, and we've got on the bottom turns per year. The per year cancels out, and you're left with days. Okay, there's one more period up here, the accounts payable period. Now, the accounts payable period, let's talk about that one. Would I use cost of goods sold or sales as my numerator? Cost of goods sold, why? Yeah, so the accounts payable is recorded at our cost, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to use cost of goods sold divided by accounts payable, and then that's going to give us accounts payable turn. We'll take 365, divide by that, will give us our accounts payable days. Okay, so we've already got that the cost of goods sold is 8,200, the inventory is 2,500, and if you don't believe me, you can look back at the previous slide. We've got 8,200 cost of goods sold, 2,500, oh wait a minute. Why are we doing 2,500 inventory? We've got 2,000 at the beginning and 3,000 at the end. Why are we doing 2,500 inventory?
Average.
Yeah, it's the average. And so if I give you beginning and end, what you do is find the average. What if I only give you one number? Use that number. But keep that in mind. If I've got beginning and end, I'm going to find the average. Okay, so 8,200 divided by 2,500 tells me 3.28. And if I take that 365 divided by 3.28, it tells me 111.3 days. Now, we haven't talked about ratios in here, but one thing I want to point out to you is that what would be good for one company in inventory days might not be good for another. For example, at Walmart, do you think their inventory days are high or low?
High.
Their days in inventory? You think that stuff just stays on the shelf forever?
A lot of it does.
Proportionally, that stuff is usually turning quite quickly. And I could prove it to you. Just go through and see how much dust is on top of the inventory at Walmart, right? Especially the produce. Produce has got to have really high turns, really low days, because what happens to it if you don't? Yeah, it goes bad. Same thing with bread. And there are occasional things like artichoke hearts and crap like that that I'm sure stay there forever. It would stay there forever if I were the only customer buying it, because I wouldn't buy it, right? Okay, my point to you is this. A business like that is going to have pretty high inventory turns. When I worked in nuclear power, we would have, so everything that we had to have was considered Q nuclear, which had to have all this traceability and all sorts of crazy crap associated with it. And we didn't keep it on hand. We had suppliers that would keep this stuff. And that stuff might sit on the shelf for 7, 9, 12 years. Why do you think that was an acceptable amount of time for inventory to sit on the shelf? Let me ask you this. How many defunct parts does it take to stop a nuclear reactor plant from working? 1. How much were we making from each unit per day? 1991, the number was $1 million per day. So, if I need a part and I've got to wait for someone to, by the way, it starts at the steel mill. That's the first place. And this traceability starts at the steel mill and has to go all the way through the machining and the processing and that whole thing. It could take months to get the part. So multiply months times $1 million a day and you start to get the idea why we would be pleased to have something on the shelf for 7, 9, 12 years, because when you need it now. Now, as a result, what do you think that meant about the price of those parts? Oh, they were way high. So I remember one time we had a part that we had to fly in, and they flew it in from Connecticut on a private jet, and it was $25,000. Do you think they ever flew me anywhere on a private jet? No, because I wasn't worth $1 million a day, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so what I'm telling you is just because someone has a high or a low days in inventory doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing a good or bad job. You need to look at the other people in the same similar business. Questions so far? Okay, let's talk about the accounts receivable period. What's another name for accounts receivable period? What does accounts receivable period represent? It's the number of days it takes what? Yeah, and so we call it the average collection period, or ACP. So you may also hear it called average collection period, or ACP. Okay, now let's talk about what's good and what's bad before we get into calculations. What if I had an accounts payable, or an average collection period of 59 days? Is that good or bad? It depends. What else do I need to know?
What are you selling?
Say again?
What are you selling?
Okay, what I'm selling determines what industry I'm in. What industry I'm in determines what?
Your terms.
Yeah, the credit terms. If everybody in my industry is doing 60 days, I've got to do 60 days too. That's just game theory. So I'm doing 60 days and my customers are paying 59. Is that good? Yeah. What if I'm telling people to pay in 30 days and they're paying in 59? That's bad. Now, here's the fun thing. When I ask students, especially my MBA students, I say, what could we do to make this situation better? I said, we're giving people 30 days to pay, they're paying in 59. What do you think? Some of the answers are totally incorrect. What do you think they suggest?
Discounts.
Okay, that's number one incorrect answer because it cost us what? Money. Another incorrect answer is, let's just give them 60 days, then they'll be paying on time. Is that how humans work? No. I'm giving them 59 days, or I'm giving them 30 days, they're taking 59. I give them 60, what are they going to do? Yeah, they're going to really blow it up. 118, whatever. They're going to really blow it up, right? So don't do that. By the way, I can give you two examples of this. Number one, I had this guy who worked for me in Dallas, Texas. His name was Ramon. Ramon was supposed to start at 3 o'clock, and Ramon was late. And I said, Ramon, what's up? This is when I just started. And Ramon says, oh, my kids, got to pick them up from school. My wife doesn't drive. And, you know, I'm trying to be the open-minded, loving supervisor. I'm like, oh, I got an idea, Ramon. Why don't we make your start time 3:15 and you just take a 45-minute lunch? He says, oh, yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. What do you think happened the next day? What time do you think he showed up? 3:30. I said, no, we're not going to play this game. You got to be here at 3 o'clock. By the way, I eventually had to fire Ramon. Back to the story. What else? Speed limits. When I was a kid, speed limit was 55 miles an hour. When I was 16, I was driving 55 miles an hour, and then they raised it to 65. Now, by the way, when I was 55 miles an hour, have you ever tried driving 55? It just drives you insane, right? And so, what was I driving? 65, right? And so then they raised it to 65, and you say, wow, if they turned Dr. Haggard into a law-abiding citizen. Is that what happened? No, how fast did I start driving? 75, and then they upped it to 70. How fast am I driving now? 80. I was down in Texas. I think the speed limit was 85 miles an hour. And I'm trying to do 95, and it just got to be too much, right? And so I actually became more law-abiding as a result of being scared crabless. Not because of me, but because of the crazies around me, right? Okay. So that's my point to you, is that's not going to work. So how do we get our accounts receivable period down? Call your customers. Tell them to pay. This is a true story. Sometimes I tell you lies, but today's the true story. This guy that was a CEO or CFO for a company that became a Fortune 500 company, but he was with him really early on. And their main raw material was steel. And so he was dealing with all sorts of steel vendors. And they were short on cash, so here's what would happen. He would get the bills for the steel, and he would write up the check. He'd put it in an envelope. By the way, this is back in typewriter days, so he's typing up the check, puts it in the envelope, types the address on the envelope, and puts a stamp on it, and then he throws it in the drawer and shuts the drawer. When do you think he pulls the check out and mails it? Let's say they give him 30 days to pay. When do you think he pulls the check out to mail it? Day 29 is what I would tell you to do. Day 29 is maximizing this interest-free loan that you've got, but it's ethical because you're following the terms of your agreement, right? No, man. How long do you think you waited? Till the phone rang. Till the phone rang. And people would call him up and they would say, hey, I think maybe you guys had a clerical error there and didn't get your checks sent out. And this would be like 60, 90 days. And he's like, oh, he says, tell you what. I said, oh, he says, oh, phew, got the check right here. Check's in the mail. And then he would go, bloop, drop it in the mail. He said, I did that for 5 years. And only one customer one supplier ever figured it out. The guy would call him on day 29. He's like, hey, Frank, why don't you drop that check in the mail? Frank's like, check's in the mail. Dropped it into him. Now, what is the moral to this story? Have you ever heard the expression, the squeaky wheel gets the grease? Yeah. Be the squeaky wheel that gets the cash. You call people up and ask for money, you've got a better than zero chance of getting it. That's how you can get that accounts receivable down. I was doing some pro bono consulting here in town. And pro bono means what? Free, right? Okay, so talking to these guys and I'm looking at their charts and I noticed that their days sales and receivable was just going up, up, up. I said, let me guess. You think of your customers as your friends? And they said, yeah. They said, how do you know? I said, because your friends are taking advantage of you. They know that because you're friends, you're not going to call and ask for the money. And so they've got other people that are doing that. So you guys are just sitting here and you're an interest-free bank for them. I said, by the way, the money you've got borrowed, is it interest-free? And they're like, no. I'm like, look, you're gifting these people. I said, I tell you what, I've got enough friends. I don't need more friends. What I need are customers that pay, which I thought was kind of funny given that I was doing pro bono consulting, right? Do you see how this works? We've got humans involved in everything, every one of these. And you guys know by now that people are scumbags, so you know how this works. But you'd be amazed at how much action you can get from just calling someone. Do you think sending an email does the same thing? Oh man, must have gone to my spam. Do you think texting does the same thing? No. Call. And hey, by the way, if they're next door, take a cup of coffee, go visit. Hey, how you doing, Frank? By the way, looking for my money, where's it at?
For a period of time at my work, I was being trained on how to do the accounts receivable stuff.
Uh-huh.
And so we do like industrial supply. And the worst is John Deere. They never want to pay the bill. It'd be like 180 days. We'll give them like 60 days to pay the bill. We call John Deere and be like, you have $5,000 outstanding from like 6 months ago. You need to pay that. They're like, oh, okay, great. Right? So when I started doing it, I would eventually realize that I was like, okay, I'm just gonna send them the email with the invoices that they have overdue balances on, and then I'm gonna call them. So I'd send them the email and I'd wait like 15 minutes and then I'd call them. And then as soon as they picked up, they'd be like, oh yeah, could you send those invoices over and let us know which ones we need to pay on? Like, they're already in your inbox.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, so that was
No excuses.
no excuses. Exactly.
That's excellent. I like that. Other thoughts or questions before we move forward here? Okay, so how are we going to calculate this? We're going to look at credit sales divided by, once again, the average accounts receivable. By the way, we've been given beginning and ending accounts receivable, and we need to average those. What if we're only given one accounts receivable? Just use it. Now, notice at the top there, it says credit sales. Most of the time, we assume that 100% of our sales are on credit. Unless I tell you otherwise, you are to assume that 100% of our sales are on credit. But if I tell you that 90% of the sales are on credit, then you would take 90% of the sales, and then that would be the credit sales. By the way, why are we only concerned about credit sales for this ratio?
You're only gonna receive after.
Yeah, that's the only thing that goes into accounts receivable, right? It's our credit sales. Okay, so we've got credit sales of 11,500, which, by the way, I think is just our total sales. Yep. And we're going to divide by our average accounts receivable of 1,800 and get 6.39. We're going to take 365, divide by that to get our receivables terms, and therefore our day sales and receivables is 57.1 days. The interpretation: on average, it takes our customers 57.1 days to pay. Does that mean they're all paying in 57.1 days? No. In fact, getting back to your story, John Deere was taking much longer than that, which meant you had people who were taking less than that to pay. I worked in accounts payable at Walmart, general headquarters, the last Christmas break of my undergraduate career. And I got these bills, and Walmart is notorious for not paying in a timely manner. And we would get these bills, and they would say 90 days overdue, and it would have interest and a penalty on there. And I would show it to my boss, and I'd say, these people are charging us an interest and a penalty. Do I pay that amount? And he says, no, just pay the base amount. I said, but we owe that. He said, no, we don't. And then he said, get ready, folks. He said, F them, we're Walmart. What does that mean? By the way, if you had a little business here in town and you were having the same conversation, could you say, F them, I'm so-and-so small engine repair? No! What's the difference?
You can't cut out a customer like Walmart.
Yeah, they're freaking huge, right? Walmart, Amazon, they can get by with this kind of bad behavior because they have that kind of power in that market. You probably don't. Now, did I think that was moral or ethical at the time? No. Did I do what I was told? Yes. Was the customer happy they got paid? Yes, because they knew how the game was played with Walmart, right? In fact, they would have been shocked if they had received the interest and penalty. I am sure that Walmart has changed their policy since 1993. Questions? Okay, now we're on to the operating cycle. We said the operating cycle is just the inventory period plus the accounts receivable period. Remember, it's from the day that stuff comes into your inventory until the day you receive the cash for the sale. We've got 111.3 days in inventory, 57.1 days accounts receivable, so we're at 168.4 days. Folks, that's roughly half a year. Does that sound optimal? No, I would really not want to have an operating cycle that long. Now, is it possible that I could and it would be okay? Yeah, once again, we got to look at the industry. Questions? Okay, now we know in order to get to this cash cycle, we have to subtract the accounts payable period from the operating cycle. So, how are we going to calculate it? As we said earlier, we're going to take the cost of goods sold because the accounts payable and the cost of goods sold are both recorded at cost the same as inventory. And we're going to use that average accounts payable. What if I only give you one accounts payable? Just use it, right? So your payables turns here are 8,200 divided by 875 or 9.37. And I can do my math, 365 divided by those terms gives me 39 days. 39 days. Okay, what does that mean? If we want to figure that cash cycle, what we're going to do is take that operating cycle and subtract out the accounts payable period. And why is that? Here's our operating cycle. Remember, it's from the day the stuff shows up to the day we receive the cash for it. But do we have to pay cash for it on the day it shows up? No, on average, we are waiting how many days to pay for that? 39 days, right? And so that means on average, our operating cycle is going to be that, or our cash cycle is going to be that operating cycle minus 39 days, which gives us 129.4 days. Questions? Now, that money, do you think that money has to come from somewhere? I mean, we've had this money basically tied up for 129.4 days. Do you think we've just got like free money laying around? No, that money has a cost associated with it, right? It's got like our cost of capital associated with it. And so we would prefer to shrink that cash cycle down. So how are we going to do that? First of all, we could reduce the inventory period, which would increase our inventory turns. Now, let's look at inventory. We've got cost of goods sold divided by inventory. That's our inventory turns. To improve that, we either have to make this greater, there's one of two things has to happen. What is it? Either the cost of goods sold goes up, meaning that we increase our sales, not that we just pay more for crap, right? Or our inventory goes down. So what's easier to do? Increase sales or reduce inventory? It's much easier to reduce inventory. So I used to be in sales, and then I got out of sales, and my sister got into sales. And right after she got into sales, we're at my folks' house for Thanksgiving dinner, and my sister had just made her first tour of her potential clients. And my mom said, "Did you sell anything?" And my sister and I busted out laughing. And here's why. Sales is not like hunting. It's like gardening. What do I mean? Yeah, so you've got to go out and visit a bunch of people, and are you going to get immediate results? No. So what is your immediate response when you are approached by a salesperson?
Right away.
Yeah. So my wife and I would be walking through Sam's Club, and these guys would say, "Have you heard what DirecTV's doing for Sam's members?" And I always wanted to say, "Have you heard what I'm doing to salespeople?" But my wife never would let me. That's probably good because I haven't been arrested. But that's and when I first showed up as a salesperson, do you think they treated me any differently? No, he's just another shyster, right? And so then you have to develop a relationship with these people. You have to build trust. You have to show that you can solve a problem for them, right? And if you can do that, then eventually you can get the sales and you can start to build on that. But building sales in a hurry is not going to happen. By the way, then students say, well, let's just offer them a discount. What's the problem with that? Yeah, it cuts into your profits, right? So there's all sorts of reasons, and I'm telling you that whenever you're looking at trying to fix a problem, increasing sales in the short term is never the answer. And so we have to look at reducing inventory. Now let's talk about how things get into inventory. By the way, this is a water tank, and the water represents the inventory, and we've got water coming out here, and we've got water going in here. How does stuff get out of our inventory?
Sell it.
Sell it. How does stuff get into our inventory?
Same.
Say again?
You didn't sell it?
No, how does it get into your inventory?
Make it or buy it.
Yeah, we either make it or buy it. Okay, now, because we want inventory to go down, to make this overall thing go up, what's going to have to be the relationship between this and these things?
Equal.
If they're equal, then that water level is going to stay the same. You guys really didn't get conservation of mass in your science education? If I turn the valve off down here and I keep putting stuff in, what's going to happen? Yeah, it's going to go up just like putting a stopper in a bathtub, right? And then what if I turn this off and I pull the stopper out of the bathtub? What happens to the level of water of the bathtub? It goes down. And so in other words, if I want this thing to go down, stuff has to be coming out faster than it's going in. Does that make sense? Okay, now, once again, we said that increasing sales in the short term is not the answer. That means I have to look up here. So what am I going to do inventory-wise? I'm going to analyze my inventory, and I'm going to see the stuff that I have too much of. Is it stuff that I bought, or is it stuff that I'm making? If you're lucky, it's stuff that you bought. Why? Yeah, you just stop buying it and you start to use down that inventory and the inventory level falls. Why do I say we're unlucky? It's stuff that we make. Okay, so, and this is how people end up with too much inventory. They're like, oh, we got to make large batches because to make the equipment run efficiently, but then you end up with way too much stuff in inventory. By the way, this is exactly what happened when I was at Halliburton. We've been running it according to this idea, and our inventory turns were 4. For our industry, inventory turns were 12. So that meant we had 3 times as much inventory as we needed, right? And so we did this analysis, and it turned out that a lot of what we needed to pull down was stuff that we had made because we were running on that theory. Now, you have, how do you reduce the stuff that you're making? What do? Okay, but right, we know we're going to need the equipment again, right? So it doesn't make sense to sell it. What can you do?
Make
What do they?
things instead.
Say again?
Make other things instead.
You know, that's often mentioned, but there are a couple of problems with that. Number 1 is finding the business. Number 2 is making sure that your people can actually make it. When we were in an oil bust, we reached out to try to find additional machining work to keep our machines busy. And we got business from Xerox, which was the big copier maker at the time. to make the rollers that go into Xerox. It's the drums, right? And they have to be very perfect, and they have to have a perfect surface finish on them. Do you think our oil field equipment was capable of? No! And whoever brought that work in was a flaming idiot, right? But that's the downside to trying to do that. I like the idea, but I've been there and got burned. Now, what else can we do?
Back on that raw materials.
Okay, so we're going to cut back on the raw materials, but if you cut back on raw materials, you need to cut back on production, folks. That's what you need to do. You need to cut back on production. For example, right now, electric vehicles, EVs, are flooding lots. Did you guys know that? EVs are sitting on the lot like 2 to 4 times as long as an internal combustion engine. And I'm not going to get into the whole politics of that thing, but this does tell us that what's going to happen if they have they been underproducing or overproducing EVs? Overproducing. So, for example, the Ford Lightning pickup, they've been running 2 shifts. Do you know what they're doing now? They're running 1 shift, right? They basically have reduced their output by 50%. In our situation, it was so bad that we had to shut down the factory cold because we had so much inventory. Remember, we had 3 times as much as we needed. And so what happened was for the first week, we spent going out there and painting or cleaning. We spent the first week cleaning. And then at the end of week 1, we took a snapshot of our inventory and we found it was still too high. So we go into week 2. Week 2, we are painting. And we let the operators choose what color to paint their machines. It was a terrible mistake because it looked like some sort of Gulf Coast beach community when we got done. And then we took another snapshot. We still had too much inventory. The 3rd week, by the way, this is July in southern Oklahoma, so far south it's almost Texas. And we send these guys out to this big property to cut weeds. That's just cruel, right? Now, at the end of the 3rd week, we take the snapshot, we're good to go. I've never seen a group of people more thrilled to walk into an air-conditioned factory as those guys coming in out of the weeds. Now, students hear the story and they say, well, wait a minute, couldn't you have just laid off your workers?
Didn't give them back.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem. So, I've got this group of people here, and I lay them off. And I don't tell them how long, because I don't know how long it's going to be till I can bring it back. So, what do my go-getters do? Yeah, they get a new job. What do my slackers do? Yeah, they're like, get employment, man, right? And they're sitting around, and they'll occasionally wander out and put in an application at Sonic so they can collect their unemployment, that sort of stuff, but they're just basically waiting it out. So who does that mean who do you get back at the end? Yeah, we called them the cream of the crap. Right? That's who you're getting back. Does that explain why we used our people to clean and paint and weed eat instead of laying them off? Absolutely. Goodyear had a plant less than 30 miles away, and they would love to have hired our people. And we knew if we let people go that we needed, that we wouldn't get them back. Questions? Okay, so that's how we reduce inventory. We've already discussed how to reduce the receivables period. What did I tell you to do? Yeah, call people, ask them for the money. And then finally, we've got our increasing of our payables period. How can we do that?
Make your suppliers your best friends.
Yeah, and so that's, you're taking it to the unethical level. Here's what I would do is tell you to take full advantage of the terms that they give you. As Mr. Dexheimer said, if they give you 30 days, pay on day 29. Does that make sense? Okay, now you could also, and by the way, Walmart's done this, negotiate longer terms with your suppliers. If you've got power, maybe they're willing to float you for 60 days instead of 30. Now, it's funny. I was telling that story. Remember the story about the man and the envelopes in the drawer? And this young lady was sitting right here. And she said, wow, I wish my company would do that. We just get a bill in and we immediately pay it. And I asked her who she worked for, and she told me. Here's the thing that blew my mind. Same company. Same company. 50 years later, but the same company. So by the time they became a mature company, and it's not the people that have their own money on the line, what happens? You get the bills and they're like, yeah, let's just pay that so we don't have to keep, we don't have to keep track of it, right? I mean, that's what I do with my bills. As soon as I get a bill, I pay it so I don't have to keep track of it. If you're running a company, is that the way you should do it? No, you should do what Mr. Dexheimer says. Wait till one day shy and send your payment. Questions? Okay, now, are there potential negative impacts from doing these things? Let's talk about the reduction in inventory. What's the potential negative impact of reducing your inventory? Yeah, there's a potential to miss out on sales. We could have stockouts. So that's for that. What about reducing our receivables period by calling our suppliers, or by calling our customers?
Customers get pissed off.
Yeah, eventually the customers may tell you where to go. And occasionally, you know what? It's worth losing that kind of a customer. If this person is habitually late and you're always having to call them, maybe you're better off without them. When I first started in the oil field, we had all these mom and pop shops that were taking forever to pay. And I said, we should dump them. And it was so funny because the old guys that had been there forever, who had established the policy of extending credit to their friends, they're like, oh no, that's the meat and potatoes. I'm like, meat and potatoes, hell, it's 1.6% of our sales, right? These people are abusing us. Okay, now what about the taking longer to pay your suppliers? Let's say that we go with Mr. Crawford's suggestion and we just try to run it as long as we can. What's possible? What could they possibly do to you? Yeah, your suppliers could cut you off. And by the way, do you think word gets around when people don't pay?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a service called Dun & Bradstreet. And when I was in management, at the last company, I got a call, and the guy says, I understand these people are your customers. I'm like, yeah. And he said, do they pay their bills on time? And I said, yes. And he said, are you 30, 60, 90 days? I said, 30. And he says, and they're paying their bills on time? And I said, yes. He said, okay, thank you. He hung up. Now, why do you think I would volunteer that kind of information? Because I'm also benefiting from Dun & Bradstreet. When I go to sell to a new customer, I'm hoping that someone else has already ratted them out if they're the kind of dirty rat finks that aren't going to pay their bills. Does that make sense? And so Dun & Bradstreet is kind of like a credit rating for businesses. Questions?
Is there a way to like legally make them pay you back, like with the contract? I'm guessing most customers don't like that.
Well, you could sue them.
So then that's a whole process to get. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And, if the amount of money isn't big enough, then your legal fees are going to outweigh whatever you would got anyway.
But I'm sure they know that too. So.
Oh, yeah. It's like people bringing these nuisance lawsuits. Isn't it easier for me to just pay Mr. Dexheimer $50,000 than to hire a $100,000 legal team to defend against his claims that Saccharine made him grow a horn, right? Does that make sense? Absolutely. Okay. Any more questions before we move on? I am definitely going to have to put the homework out further. Yay! Now let's talk about the cash budget and short-term borrowing. Remember, we said that the third question, working capital management, was the most important question because it's how we ensure the survival of the firm, at least in the short term. Which means we need to always have cash to pay our bills. And we need to forecast what's going to be going on with our cash in order to know if we need to do some short-term borrowing. Do I want to wait to run out of money before I do my borrowing? No, I want to have that money in hand. And so you can predict going forward when you're going to need more money. And so surpluses is when you've got extra, deficits when you don't have enough. If you have a deficit, then we need to be able to borrow in the short term to keep things moving. And once again, firms go bankrupt because they run out of cash, not because of a lack of profits. So, the foundation of the cash budget is the sales forecast. What do we know about forecasts? They're swags, which means they are likely wrong. And the further out in time you go, the more incorrect they probably are. So we need to keep that in mind, that there's some risk here. And so that means, of course, we're going to need to keep a cushion of cash. I think I've had at least one group in here get into the overdraft loan situation on BSG because they did not plan for a big enough cushion of cash. The uncertainty on their sales forecast, obviously things did not go as well as we'd hoped, right? And you end up with a cash deficit at that point. Okay, now we're told that the firm starts the year with accounts receivable of 120 and has a 45-day collection period. If I have accounts receivable of 120 and 45-day collection period, that means within the next 45 days, how much of that accounts receivable should I have collected? 120, all of it, right? Okay, so we're going to start by figuring out our cash collections. We are, and this is the first bullet point we just talked about, we assume that all the outstanding accounts receivable is going to be collected by the end of the quarter, since the collection period is 45 days, and the quarters are 90 days long. Now, do you think we get 100%? Absolutely not. Our average collection period is 45 days. Are we going to get 100%? Absolutely not. If you know that you always get basically 97% of your accounts receivable, then go ahead and make that adjustment. Assume that you're going to be receiving 97% of those within 45 days, not the full amount. We also assume that half of the new sales in the quarter are going to be collected before its end. How does that work? Well, if you sell something in the first 45 days, then you should be collecting for it in the second 45 days. But those things that are sold in the second 45 days, we're not going to collect for those. They're going to become what for the next quarter? Yeah, so that's the account receivable for the beginning of the next quarter. And so here we've got our sales in millions. And we're going to start out with 120. They told us that's our beginning receivables. And then we sold 200 in quarter one. How much of that did we actually collect? 90-day quarters, 45-day terms. How much of that 200 did we collect?
100.
Yeah, 100. Now, we've got that 100, plus we've got the 120 from the beginning. We add those together. That gives us 220. And so that's our cash collections of 220. And what's left over is our ending receivables. So we've got 120 plus 200 minus 220. That gives us 100. Now, the other way I could have found ending receivables was simply by taking 1/2 of the sales. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, that ending receivables becomes our beginning receivables for the next quarter. The next quarter, we're told that our sales are going to be 300. How much of that do we actually collect during the quarter? I honestly thought this was going to be getting easier for you at this point. So 150, because half, right? 45 days out of 90 is 1/2. 1/2 times 300 is 150. So we're going to be collecting 150 plus that beginning receivables of 100. And we add those together and we get 250. Okay, now when I subtract, I get my endings receivables of 150. Once again, I could also just look at 1/2 of sales, and that would be my ending receivables. That becomes my beginning receivables for quarter three. In quarter three, we've got 250 in sales. How much of that am I actually going to collect?
235. Wait, which one are we looking at?
We're looking at quarter three. How much of that 250 am I actually going to collect?
125.
Yeah, 125. Now, where did the other 150 come from?
The beginning receipt.
Yeah, so beginning receivables plus that 125 gives me 275. And then I subtract that and I get 125, which also happens to be 1/2 of the sales. And finally, we have now beginning receivables of 125. We have sales of 400. Of that 400, how much are we going to collect? 200. And how much is going to be left over as ending receivables? 200. And so that means total cash collections are going to be that original 125 plus the 200, or 325. Do you guys see how this works? Okay, it's not hard, but it's one of those things you have to be able to keep in mind how this is all flowing. Now we need to talk about cash outflows. So, what kinds of outflows do we have? Well, we've got our payments of accounts payable. And so we've got all the things that we bought, raw material and such, that we bought on credit. We've got to pay for that stuff. And we've got to pay for our wages, taxes, and other expenses. We may also have capital expenditures. By the way, do you think we have capital expenditures in every quarter? Probably not. And then we have our long-term financing expense, which would be your interest and your dividends. By the way, accounting and finance, we differ on treatment of interest and dividends, but can we agree that payment of both interest and dividends requires cash? Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why those are showing up there under long-term financing expense. So, how can we figure this out? Well, they tell us basically that our accounts payable is 60% of sales. Why would accounts payable be a percentage of sales? Say again.
That's how you calculate it.
That's how you calculate it, yes. Well, why? If I'm buying a raw material, turning it into something, and selling it, and I'm buying that raw material on credit, does it make sense that the accounts payable would be a proportion of the finished good, right? And so what we're saying here is basically our cost of goods sold here is 60%. 60% of whatever our sales is. Our sales in quarter one were 100 or were 200. And so our accounts payable is going to be 120. Wages and other expenses. Now they don't mention it here, but it's actually 20% of sales. And how do I know that? If you take that first line, divide it by 3, you get the second line. And so it's also a percentage of sales. And that kind of makes sense too, because the more we produce, the more labor we consume, and that sort of thing. Okay, now capital expenditures, we only see that there's one quarter here with a capital expenditure, and that is the second quarter. And then our long-term financing expenses, interest and dividends, is 20 in every period. Does it make sense that that stays the same every period? Interest is fixed amounts, right? And your dividends, typically companies do dividend policy to try to keep consistent dividends. And so it makes a lot of sense that that number is fixed. It would make no sense for it to be a percentage of sales unless they had some sort of dividend payout ratio policy. Okay, so now we know the money that's coming in, and we know the money that's going out. And so we can put these together and figure out where we're going to need money. Now, a piece of information that has not been given here is how much money we start with. By the way, do you think you should always have some cash? Right. You should always have some cash. So we're assuming we walk into this with 20 in cash. Go ahead and write that down. Assume we walk in with 20 in cash. In quarter one, we have 220 coming in. We have 180 going out. So we have a cash surplus of 40. What is our cash balance now? 60. So we've got 60 in cash. By the way, I'm going to go back and add it to the slides before the next time I teach this. But there is, the next piece of this shows keeping a buffer of 10, right? And so we've got 60 in cash here, but if we're planning to keep a buffer of 10, we're really looking at that we're 50 above the buffer, not 60. And once again, we found out that it's important to keep a buffer because the forecast may be wrong. Okay, now, so we've got a total of 60 in cash, and then we go into quarter 2 here. We've got 60 in cash, we add 250. And so now we've got 310 in cash, but we're subtracting, and let me go about this another way. We walked into this thing with 60. Let's talk about quarter 2. We're bringing in 250, and we're spending 360. Is that a good situation? No. And in fact, it puts us to a minus 110 situation, and we walked into this thing with 60 in cash, and now we had 110 flow out. So what's our new cash balance? Negative 50. By the way, if you have a negative 50 cash balance, what does that mean for the likelihood of your firm surviving? That's bankrupt, right? You're bankrupt. That's so because you can't pay your bills. And so certainly we need to do something before we get to quarter 2 to fix this situation. Now, I want you to remember, why do we have such a huge cash outflow for quarter 2? Does anyone remember? Yeah, we had a capital expenditure of 100. If we hadn't have had that, it would only be negative 10 for the quarter. We would have a cash balance of 50. Everything would be hunky-dory. So this is a problem that's been brought on by that capital expenditure, and we'll discuss what that means to us here in a little bit. Okay, so now we're at negative 50 for our balance. We move forward. The next quarter, we collect 275 and pay out 220, which gives us a surplus of 55. 55 plus negative 50, what's our new cash balance? 5, right? We're positive, but are we up to that 10 buffer? No, so that would not be an acceptable situation either. But if we take care of this quarter 2 situation, do you think quarter 3 is going to be just fine? Should be. Okay, moving on. Now we've got a cash balance of 5. We are paying out, or we are collecting 325 while paying out 340, which is negative 15. What's 5 minus 15? Negative 10. But once again, if we had taken care of the problem back in before quarter 2, we would still be okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's interpret this result. So that large cash outflow in the second quarter, it's because of that planned capital expenditure. If we were having a deficit on our short-term cash flows, we should use short-term borrowing to fix that problem. Is a capital expenditure short-term or long-term? The very word capital has in it the idea of long-term, right? Capital expenditure, a machine, a building, an airplane, right? So this capital expenditure, should we be funding it with short-term debt? No, and we should be doing long-term debt. In fact, a good rule of thumb is to try to match the financing with the thing, right? And so a house, we've got 30-year financing. Why do you think 30-year financing on a house and only 5 years on a car? Do you think houses last longer than cars? Absolutely. Now, the other thing is they're more expensive too, right? Let me give you an example of what happens when people, by the way, interest rates, typically, what's higher, short-term or long-term? Yeah, typically short-term. And right before the financial crisis, they were building this, several casinos. It's Aria and some others out in Las Vegas. They're just right next to New York, New York. And they were spending lots of money on this to try to make it fancy because, you know, it's the boom era, and they're using lots of short-term financing because interest rates have started creeping up. Short-term financing had lower interest rates. Well, that's all fine as long as you can continue to refinance. But what happens? We've got the financial crisis. The short-term credit markets dry up. Do you think anybody wants to buy new short-term debt from these people that are building this totally unnecessary casino complex? Absolutely not. And so they got very, very close to bankruptcy. In fact, they had to reach out to, I forget whether it was Qatar or Dubai or whoever, their national wealth fund, to actually take a bunch of equity in the project in order to stave off bankruptcy. They had to sell like 60% of it to this Middle Eastern country. Do you think you want to sell 60% of a project that you think is going to be profitable? No, no one wants to share like that. If they had been smart and had been doing long-term financing like they should have been, would they have been in that situation? Absolutely not. So what am I telling you about that 100? We should be financing that on the long term. Shouldn't be part of our short-term borrowing. Let's talk about short-term borrowing. We already talked about the long-term debt, the long-term capital investment, but your short-term stuff you can cover with short-term borrowing. And there are two kinds of short-term borrowing, unsecured and secured. What is secured borrowing? Yeah, there's collateral. If you don't pay, then I can take something. That's secured borrowing. What's unsecured borrowing? Yeah, there's no collateral. This is what our government does, by the way, right? And there's no collateral. If they don't pay, you can't take Arkansas. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so we've got unsecured borrowing and secured borrowing. Which one do you think has a higher interest rate? Unsecured has to because it's riskier. Let's talk about unsecured long or short-term borrowing. The first thing we're going to talk about is the line of credit. And basically, that's an agreement. You sit down with your bank and you come up with this amount that you can borrow up to. Now, do you have to borrow the full amount? No. Do you have to borrow any of it? No. It's just there if you need it. Will they allow you to borrow more than the line of credit? Not without some sort of renegotiation. Now, typically, we have to have what's called a cleanup period. In other words, you're allowed to have this outstanding for a year, but then you have to pay it all off and stay out of this short-term borrowing for a month before you can engage in more withdrawals from your line of credit. Why would we do that? Remember earlier we said the short-term borrowing typically has a lower interest rate than long-term borrowing. What might the temptation be for firms? I want to buy a new machine. This machine's going to last 10 years. But oh my goodness, they're asking for 12% on it. But I got the line of credit down at the bank for 5%. Why don't we just use that line of credit to buy our machine? Does that make sense? Now, if I am doing one of these cleanup periods, I wouldn't be able to do that. If I'm forced once a year to pay this thing down to zero, I wouldn't be able to do this. So basically, it's the bank's way of preventing people from abusing that short-term borrowing. And it's also, you could think of people being addicted to short-term borrowing. If you could go 30 days without whatever it is that you typically use, would you be able to say you're not addicted to it? Just drawing an analogy here with the physical world, right?
Don't some banks too also like have a utilization rate on them? So like you can't, for each month, you can't like exceed that?
Oh, I'm sure there are plenty of different situations that could be, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, here's the fun thing. Well, let's talk about the rest of this, and then we'll talk about the fun thing. It can be committed or uncommitted. Committed means the bank is going to loan you this money regardless. Uncommitted means the bank can back out of it. When would the bank back out? When they thought what?
You're not gonna pay.
Yeah, when they thought you're not going to pay. Oh man, it's my irrigation guy. I'll call him back. Okay, when the bank thinks you're not going to pay. And so let's talk about when people typically tap lines of credit. It's when they're having a problem, right? This is kind of a backup thing. It's when they're having a problem. And so actually, I told that guy I would not be available between 11 and 12:15. And when does he freaking call me? I love him that he's got a weird sense of time. Okay, back to the story. If they're, where were we? Committed. So when are you going to use it? When you're in trouble. This was so funny. Back right after the financial crisis, people were looking for improvements in the economy. And Obama had just taken office. And Obama says, there's good news. People are borrowing more. Now, usually that's a sign of economic health. But when we started to look into the numbers, where do you think they were borrowing? Their letters of credit. Is that a sign of health? No, that's a sign of suck, right? That sucks. You don't want that. Now, the banks know that, so that's why the non-committed, they're not going to charge as much because it's going to allow them to get away from these bad situations. A committed line of credit, they're going to make you pay more for because they are taking a higher risk. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, then we have a revolving credit arrangement. It's like a line of credit, but it's open for 2 or more years. So, most of you have a credit card, I'm guessing. That is a revolving credit arrangement. It's open for a longer period of time. And does your credit card have a cleanup period? No. They're not concerned that you're an addict to short-term borrowing, are they? Okay, so it's open for a longer amount of time. So that's the big principal difference between the line of credit and the revolving credit arrangement. Okay, now let's skip forward and talk about or something else that may be part of borrowing from the bank. The bank may require you to put some money on deposit with them that is a percentage of the loan. And you're not going to earn much, if any, interest on that. Now, basically what this means is you're giving the bank an interest-free loan. And so this is part of their compensation for loaning you money. And so we're going to see that your cost of borrowing is not just the stated interest rate. We're going to have to figure out what the actual interest rate is that you're going to pay based on that amount that they make you put away with no interest. And then finally we have the letter of credit, which is a promise by a bank to make a loan if certain conditions are met. So typically where we see letters of credit would be import-export stuff, and basically that if the goods are delivered and inspected by a third party, then we will loan this the Mud House coffee shop the money to go ahead and buy those beans. And so that's how letters of credit would typically work. Now, they can be revocable or irrevocable. Does that sound a lot like committed or uncommitted? Yeah, which would you rather have, revocable or irrevocable? Yeah, irrevocable. What does that mean for the cost? It's going to be higher for the irrevocable. Now, on letters of credit, typically we're just financing normal course of business kind of stuff. So tapping a letter of credit is considered normal. Tapping your line of credit might be a sign of problems. And so my guess is that that difference between revocable and irrevocable, the cost is not as big as the difference between committed and uncommitted for the line of credit. Questions? So let's talk about this compensating balance. When you've got to leave money in there and you can't touch it and they're not paying you any interest, there's actually a cost to that. And so let's talk about how we can figure out what the true cost of that is. Our quoted interest rate on our credit line is 16%, but the lender requires a 10% compensating balance. So if I'm going to borrow $100,000, they tell me I've got to put $10,000 in their account at 0 interest, and that's my compensating balance. I need $54,000. If I need $54,000, how much am I going to have to borrow? Well, we know that $54,000 represents 90% of the amount that I need to borrow. So I'm just going to take $54,000 divide by 0.9. And that's going to tell me that I actually need to borrow $60,000. And so I'm going to go ahead and borrow $60,000, and I will be paying 16% on that $60,000. And so that means I'm going to be paying $9,600 a year to borrow $54,000. That's the amount of money I actually receive. And so if I take that $9,600 divide by 54,000, I see that my true interest rate on this thing is not 16%. It's 17.78%. It's got to be higher because I'm not getting full use of that money. And so when I'm trying to figure out what is my cost of debt here, I would go with the 17.78 number, not the 16. Does that make sense?